Well, I hope you all had a good week and are continuing to enjoy Elaine Pagels. Um, I sometimes wish that we had a companion volume of Gnostic Gospels that we could, and of course, there is one available, but it's about that thick. And it came out 20, 25 years ago. But it has these Gnostic Gospels available with all of a lot of these manuscripts codices did, they were in pretty rough shape when they were found. So scholars had to kind of piece together, uh, you know, spaces that had, become disintegrated in the text and things like that. So whenever you see something in the brackets, for example, in our book, that means that is the scholar's best guess as to what actually went in there. So in the square brackets, if you're reading some of these texts, I thought I would point that out. And maybe you all know that, but you know, we we can't assume that these texts were all of a piece and very in excellent shape because many of them were not. And much of what scholars do in these ancient, reading these ancient documents is just working with a pair of tweezers and doing an elaborate jigsaw puzzle trying to put things together. So, anyway, do you have any questions or thoughts before we get started? I want to, take a good run into chapter 3 on God the Father and God the Mother. Any announcements or anything like that before we get started? I think Will has joined us. Yeah, there we go. Karen, everybody.
Dan,
Well,
United Harvest is on Saturday.
oh, that's right. United Harvest is
Yep,
on Saturday. So if you haven't
yep.
signed up,
Y'all
should be,
welcome.
yeah, it should be good weather. Have you seen the sign up list, Sharon? Does it look
It should
like,
be going up. Well, it's up, but I haven't checked it again. I usually check it on Friday night. But
yeah,
yeah, but you're all welcome.
yeah.
Yeah, the sign up is real easy. Kylie sends it out.
I was just wondering if you'd seen how many people had signed up because last month we were just a little bit short when it came to cart pullers, but
Yeah.
no, we always seem to manage. So, any other announcements? Thank you for that. That's a good reminder. If not, let's get into chapter 3, and this is a fun chapter for Pagels, and the one that really, when she wrote this book, uh, really caught fire among particularly feminist biblical scholars. Now, remember, this was the 70s when this was originally published, and was, it may seem like old hat to us, 50 years later, but it was, it really took the scholarly world by storm. Not that there hadn't been inklings or intimations of this kind of literature in the past, because we knew that there were Gnostic Gospels that had been identified by mostly the church fathers, and the church fathers would write about them, from their very apologetic standpoint and mostly condemning them. But for the first time, when Nag Hammadi documents were found, we had the opportunity to read these. And one of the things that really stood out among these documents were uh, it just seemed like a proliferation of references to God as mother, feminine imagery of God, which is unusual for the three uh, ancient Near Eastern, I should say, the three monotheistic religions that arise out of the ancient Near East and especially the Middle East. We're looking at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, those three traditions are really, despite the fact that their numbers comprise the majority of religious people in the world together, um, it's not unusual in the world's religions to recognize both the female and the male aspect of God. And I mentioned last time that, if you look at a lot of ancient Near Eastern or just ancient religions in general, there are usually gods and goddesses. We looked at Tiamat and Marduk and Baal and Asherah, Zeus and Hera, and we could go on and on. In Native American traditions, Father Sky and Mother Earth being prominent. But for some reason, and it might give us pause to reflect a little bit, but for some reason, the three traditions that we know so well, these monotheistic traditions, have well, let's just call it what feminists have called it, an inherent misogyny, a fear of, or even as the word is literally described and literally translated, a hatred of women. Not that there haven't been attempts to introduce this idea into both Judaism and Christianity, and probably to a lesser extent Islam. Though my knowledge of that movement, if there is a feminist movement trying to understand the feminine aspect of God or of Allah in Islam, I'm not familiar with it. So, but any thoughts on, just from a anthropological point of view, or from ecological point of views, which is the one that I kind of take, on why it is that these three traditions all, having their origin in the ancient Near East, the desert region of, what we know of today as Syria and Egypt, and that area. Why is it that the emphasis on the male god has been so important? Anything come to mind immediately?
Dan, I would suggest that uh, the Gnostics dropping into a deeply paternalistic uh, cultures in that area, uh, it simply was not going to survive. Uh, there's again, it's it goes too deep, too far back in the memory bank
Yeah,
of virtually every person who has been socialized, both female and male, as they grow into adolescence and adulthood. And, you know, those of us that think highly of the feminist movement, um, yeah, can nod our head in approval, but man, that was a swift current to try to swim against.
sure, sure. Any other thoughts people like? I like to think of this in terms of ecology in a lot of ways, and imagining that, we are products of uh, our culture, but also of our ecological context as well. And if you think, well, first of all, by contrast, if you look at the places where uh, emphasis upon the goddess is so strong, you will make a correlation, or I have made a correlation between uh, just the fecundity of nature. Think about the rainforest, for example, where, or parts of India where if you drop a seed on the ground the next day, something's popping up, and this whole vitality and once again fecundity that is so prevalent there, and just so much a part of one's intuition living in a green, lush area. But when we look at the ancient Near East, uh, water is scarce. These are desert religions that we're talking about. When we talk about Judaism, we're talking about, Judaism that was inherited by Christianity. And then we also have, the religion coming out of Saudi Arabia, or present day Saudi Arabia, of Islam. And th this was a place where, uh, the emphasis was on if you didn't have it, you had to go out and get it, and you had to go out and fight for it, right? And a lot of warfare, a lot of aggression to get the basic necessities of life. If there were water in an oasis, you and your tribe or you and your clan would fight over it. It's quite a contrast to the abundance that we see, for example, let's say along the Indus River Valley in India, where things just grow naturally. Well, the emphasis in such a context, in a ecological context of scarcity, is on what power can do and what aggression can do to win, the basic things and the basic stuff of life. And so it's only a matter of time before we begin to think of the giver of all things as possessing the same qualities as the one, the male in these regions of scarcity. But it's not true around the world. And this is the interesting thing about Christianity, because much of Christianity has been influenced by the Greek and Roman tradition that has, of course, references to gods and goddesses as well. And so what we're seeing, I think, when we read some of the early texts of the first and second century, especially the second century, when a lot of this comes to a head, is that conflict between kind of a Hebraic mentality that says God is male and God is powerful, God is authoritarian, and all of those things. And on the other hand, the intuition that people have just living in a Greco-Roman culture, that there is something of the divine that has a feminine quality as well. Now, some of the feminist authors in the last several decades have suggested that there was an original Hebrew goddess. Because remember, in the ancient Near East, there were goddess religions as well. We think of Baal and Asherah, which grew up out of Canaan in the very landscape that the Jews were living or the Israelites were living. And we know in the Old Testament that throughout the stories of the historical development of the Israelites, these traditions, especially the Canaanite religion of Baal, the male storm god, the god of fertility, and Asherah, his mother, also the goddess of fertility, these were the religions that were drawing people away and were always seen as the temptations, to move away from the true tradition of the covenant community. So the feminine aspect of these traditions becomes maligned. However, there have been some feminist scholars who have said that over time, over about a 2,000-year period of time, before the time of Jesus, there was a Hebrew goddess who was a consort to Yahweh. But as the traditions that we know them, the Yahwist and the Elohist tradition, the Deuteronomist and the priestly tradition, as they developed and were edited over time, that tradition of the feminine God, the divine feminine, was basically edited out. Now, I wanted to mention this last time, and I didn't have a chance to, but I've been telling you about a woman I've been reading named Margaret Barker, who is one of these scholars who said that, the feminine aspect of God has been edited out over time. She suggests that when we look at the temple tradition and the idea of the priest going in on the Day of Atonement, sprinkling the blood, consecrating the path to the Holy of Holies, that when the priest goes into the Holy of Holies and there becomes one with God and literally sits on the throne of God and becomes a son of God, that the throne was often seen as the consort of Yahweh. Not often, the throne was seen as the consort of Yahweh, that he becomes one with the mother who is the consort of the Father. So you have this kind of Trinitarian understanding of the high priest in the Holy of Holies, who becomes through ritual, the Son of God, as well as the Son who sits on the throne, who is the goddess, the consort of Yahweh. And this is suggestive of what we see later on in some of the imagery that we see in art history when Jesus, we have this, as Protestants, we have this very, very ambiguous relationship with the Virgin Mary. Even as Catholics, there's kind of an ambiguous relationship there because she's not divine, but she is accorded probably as much, as much divinity as you could possibly imagine without calling her a goddess, right? Very important. What Margaret Barker suggests is that these images of Jesus on the lap of Mary that we see throughout Christian history is a hearkening back to this temple ritual where the high priest goes and becomes a son of God and sits on the lap, if you will, of the goddess who is a consort of Yahweh. Really intriguing argument to make, is probably as legitimate as anything that we're seeing from, some of these Gnostics. But all of this to say is that there is something about our human experience that brings forth, that evokes this sense that God is beyond gender. But more than that, when we try to explain who God is natural to appeal to feminine metaphors and feminine imagery. And we see this in the history of the religions from around the world. And I'll give you some examples. But let me stop and see if anybody would like to respond to what I've just kind of threw at you, just kind of bombed you with. Sound too complex? Far out?
Looking at this through a political science lens, it seems to me that when you're trying to lead an institution, and I'm hard pressed to think of very many institutions that are successfully led by co-presidents or co-popes or co-directors, or and your point about desert survival and desert religions,
Mhm.
is I think, a perfect example that, who's going to lead the charge? I mean, it's like, well, who's going to do it today? Well, it's your turn. Well, no, it's your turn. Well, let's flip for it. Uh,
Right,
no.
right. But isn't it interesting, and speaking of political science, that democracy tries to challenge the excesses that come with that very kind of structure? And in that challenge, the question becomes, well, why couldn't a woman be as much a decision maker as a man, right? And we've seen this played out in our lifetimes, uh, probably not as successfully as we would like to have seen. I heard a great quote by Margaret Thatcher, who's I've never been much of a fan of, but I do like this quote. Maybe you've heard it. If you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. Do you know that quote? Yeah, there's it's the Iron Maiden. Uh, but to your point, Denny, feminists have said that a more if we went into matriarchal cultures, we don't have that kind of hierarchy. You had Native American cultures who are matriarchal and living in kind of subsistence, if not you know realms of scarcity, who nevertheless made decisions as a group. You had, women who'd make certain decisions about certain aspects of culture and men who would make other decisions. But we have hyper masculinity, and I don't think I need to make that argument very strongly because it's all over today, especially given, our current situation with the Iran war and the fact that we've got two hyper patriarchal cultures who can't come to an agreement on anything. But what I wanted, oh, did you want to say something, Sharon, or did I see you? Anybody else like to make a comment here?
I was thinking of the concept of legacy and and then you mentioned editing. So I had two ideas going there. Editing assumes that um, male people are writing.
Yeah,
And if they're the primary scribes, they've got a lot more power. And if women were communicating through textiles and art, that may have been less important or perhaps have been lost with with time more easily. And then
mhm.
the legacy part, um, I'm wondering because a mother has a natural legacy if she gives birth to a child. And men seem to maybe be interested in establishing themselves forever and ever in monuments and gold
Yeah,
statues and things like that.
yeah. Can you think of an example? I'm not quite with you there. Do you have an example that you can give us
Well,
there? I'm,
I'm
I'm
just
being,
thinking a mother, whether she's a god or someone more common, is a mother and has given birth to someone who will succeed her. And a
yeah,
guy just doesn't have that option very, very viscerally, and biologically.
yeah.
So those two things don't necessarily fit together. But if you lose track of the communication among women because it's been um, lost in thread, if you will, lots of women have said that over time. Or I've seen quilts before that were made to be used and not kept. They're not
Right.
wrapped in stone or clay pots. So there are things missing over time,
Yeah.
as well as the concept of just biologically, you if you have ability to give birth, you leave a legacy.
You leave a legacy, and you also leave a lot of envious people of the other gender. We're going to try to leave a legacy, but ironically, in precisely the opposite way by killing as much and erecting phallic monuments to their greatness. Anyway, this is fascinating to think about just the gendering, if you will, of anthropology and development of cultures over time. And the point I really want to make is just how unusual and unique these three Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions are with respect to their gendering of God, because there's so much about our prehistoric history that mitigates against that. Let me just get my next slide here. Um, if you're familiar with some of the earliest religious images that we have from 45,000 years ago, in Europe, there's one called this is over here, if you can see my cursor, something known as the Willendorf Venus. It's about this, about 10 inches high, and it was a figurine that was found, deep in a cave during an excavation. But it was, surrounded by other aspects of this idea that the person that they owed their allegiance to, the person that whoever made this figurine or the god was a person of great fecundity who gave birth, a goddess figure. Over here on the right, this was from 45,000 years ago. God, the Venus of Willendorf. They're all referred to as Venus, but they probably weren't called that at the time. This was known as the Venus of Lassell. And you can see once again the birthing hips, the breasts that are emphasized here. And she's holding this horn, which by the way is a symbol of fertility. You cut horns off and they grow back. but you can't see it very well here. But if you note on the horn itself, the symbol of the crescent moon, you see there are 13 notches that have been etched into the horn itself, which are reflective of the 13 phases, or excuse me, the 13 moons of a year. Here's another example of masculinity being imposed upon time. We have a 12 calendar year, or a 12 year, excuse me, a 12-month calendar that, we have to, well, some days have 28, some days have 30, and others have 31. We have to remember this nice little jingle to help us remember how many days April has in it. But if we were to impose what we might call a lunar chronology on our year, it breaks down very nicely into 13 calendar months determined by the moon, 13 phases of the moon. The moon's association with a goddess came to be seen as somehow a threat. And so we came up with this Roman calendar that just does not seem to make sense. But were we to go with the lunar calendar, interestingly, as the Jews have, which is very interesting in and of itself, we would have, months that were exactly 28 and 1/4 days long. So this association of women with the moon, women with the phases of the moon, which related to the menstrual cycle, came to be part of the experience, of earliest human beings. And then, in later religions, they came to be personalized. They took on human faces. When you think of the oldest religion that we know of that has texts, at least, when we look at Hinduism, the various gods of Hinduism, they all have female consorts. They're always a god and goddess pair. Now, interestingly, by the time we get to, the rise of Hinduism around, the 2000 BC and afterwards, the gods become primary, but they are not entirely independent. We're not into monotheism yet. There are aspects of human experience that are represented by goddesses. So here we have Shiva and Shakti, Shiva and Parvati. In Hinduism, it's the religion of 10,000 gods, as it's called. In Chinese Taoism, and the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of what we're going to be talking about in Gnosticism has some connection with Chinese Taoism more than anything else. But if you know the Tao Te Ching, if you know the symbol that you see displayed on the screen here, something simply referred to as the Tai Chi or the symbol of the Tao, this is an impersonal understanding of the way the world works. There are no gods or are no goddesses, but there is movement and process in the world that can be described as an interplay between male and female qualities, not as a conflict between male and female qualities, but the way that creation takes place. There is give and take. There is light and dark. There is male and female working together in this kind of infinite dance that produces the world in which we live in. And it's not a world that has a beginning or an end. It is just process all the way down. But if you look at this figure, you will see that the white will represent the yang. People often refer to this as yin and yang, but that's not how you pronounce it. It's yin and yang. White represents maleness here, and then the black represents femaleness or yin. But you'll note that every bit of maleness, the white, has a bit of femaleness within it. And every bit of femaleness, here I'm looking for my cursor, has a bit of maleness in it as well. So it's the interplay of these two things that creates this constant revolution, you might say, this constant movement that creates the world. And when those two things come to be in conflict with each other, not in a dance, not in a cooperation, but when they come into conflict with each other, you have disharmony and you have disease. And so the Taoist religion is all about trying to tap into, as individuals, this movement that is inherent in the natural world. And so there's a book called the Tao Te Ching, which gives us a creation story that's not unlike what we're going to hear about when we think about emanations. We're talking about how the Gnostics refer to God as this ineffable source that emanates uh, entities that eventually result in the creation of the world. Well, the Taoists have something similar, and I'll try to do my best to uh, annotate this. But if you look at the first two lines of the Tao Te Ching, it's very similar to what we're hearing about how we talk about God. The Tao that can be named, the way, Tao just simply means the way of the world, the way of nature. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. You can't put a name on it. It transcends, it rises above any kind of objectification, right? But when we think about how the world comes into being, this way that's nameless gives birth to one. Let's imagine that's the circle there. And the one gives birth to two. The circle becomes divided with this kind of S figure. The two gives birth to three. The S figure, the yin and the yang are actually not two, but they are three things because they share, something between them. And then the three give birth to what the Chinese call the 10,000 creatures. The three give birth to all the things in the world, every manifestation of being. And everything, single one of those things contains within it this movement of the Tao. Three gives birth to the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things with yin at their back and yang in their embrace and breath between them for harmony. I know this sounds like we're going off on a tangent here, and I don't want it to seem that way, but I know at this point it really does. But my my suggestion to you is that by the time the Gnostics are thinking about who Jesus is, they have already by, beginning of 400 BCE, because of, trade routes across China, the Silk Road, for example, going into Asia, into Europe, they have come in contact with various forms of Eastern religious traditions. And much of what we see in the Gnostic understanding of how the world was created really harkens back to, well, in a lot of ways to this Chinese Taoism, but we see aspects of Hinduism, especially from the Upanishads as well. So um, it's a threat. It's a threat from the outside that is being introduced into the very controlled environment of Judaism, that tries to be maintained into Christianity as well. So thank you for indulging me, but this idea of, God as being represented by both male and female, every time I look at a painting by Marc Chagall, if you've ever seen his paintings, he's always got, men and women being married, and sometimes floating above his shtetl in Russia. And I really think it's been informed by this idea of, Chagall was a Jew and felt the feminine aspect of God as strongly as the male aspect of God. And I think it comes out clearly for me in some of his representations. Anyway, thank you for that, for indulging me on that little diversion. So, any thoughts about this or any comments?
Well done, Dan. And this is why syncretic, the idea of the syncretic is so important. And that's when that in that article I sent everybody, uh, because it seems to me the camp of the Orthodox simply cannot deal with the idea of syncretic,
Yeah.
and the Gnostics and um, the people who deal with the practical reality on the ground deal with it all the time
Yeah.
because of recognizing, where these ideas morphed from and are still in many ways shaping, current belief.
Yeah. And just to be clear, when you say syncretic, you're referring to syncretism, and that is the blending, the bringing together of two traditions to make a third tradition.
Exactly.
And I'm going to show my other side here. We see that today when we look at New Age types of religious traditions. And there are some things about New Age that are just too way out for me, like I I want to believe that crystals can have some sort of effect on my spiritual life, but it just doesn't seem to be practical for me. So, it's not like I'm all for syncretizing everything because there has to be a nice balance. I've mentioned this even the last couple of times. There does have to be a nice balance. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the literalists, the fundamentalists who are not willing to entertain any kind of ideas. But somewhere between how that pendulum swings from left to right, there is a happy medium that will always, introducing new things helps us to move forward. It's the idea of the yin and yang moving forward and new creation. Um, uh, but where does it become disruptive? That's the difficult question. And for the early fathers of the church, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others, Clement of Alexandria, they thought the Gnostics were going to be just a little too disruptive. And what Pagels is saying, they they didn't really base their decision on theological uh, arguments, but it was more socioeconomic and political arguments that ruled the day in this respect. Um, but when we look at any other comments or questions, I don't want to keep rolling on. Thank you for sending that article, Denny. I look forward to reading it. Um, when we look at some of the Gnostic documents, the Gnostic gospel, we see that they're really all over the place. We saw last time how we look at the Gospel of Thomas. Uh, One of the texts of the Gospel of Thomas says that Mary, in order for her to become enlightened, she must first become a male, right? Which suggests a very strong misogyny. But on the other hand, you have other texts that have a very elaborate cosmogony, the way that the world was created, an understanding of what happened in the beginning and how we came to be where we are now and how we relate to that original creation. Um, and when we look at the Gnostic Gospels, we see characterizations of the feminine aspect of God as falling under three categories, basically. And they move from the most obscure to the more concrete, I would say. And the first of these is that in the beginning, there was first, as I said, with the Tao, and the Tao that was nameless became one, and the one became two. In the beginning, there was a nameless God who became two. And that original dyad was the source of all of creation. There was the eternal Father, known as the ineffable one, who emanates silence. And from the eternal Father, the seed was planted inside silence, who was female. So the eternal Father plants the seed within the female silence, and from that union, comes the emanations, and from those emanations comes the world that which has been created. And sometimes in the Gnostic Gospels, these entities are referred to as mind, being male, and intelligence, being female. And it's just as yin and yang are on the backs of the 10,000 creatures, just as maleness and femaleness are the creative force that makes the world move forward in Taoism, so in the Gnostic Gospels, mind and intelligence is the creative force that keeps the world moving forward. And this quote is helpful on page 51. I'm going to really start down on page 50 or so. Another Gnostic writing called The Great Announcement, quoted by Hippolytus in his Refutation of All Heresies. Hippolytus was a church father and, just referred to this document by title. Now we have it available to us. This document explains the origin of the universe as follows. From the power of silence, female, appeared a great power, the mind of the universe, which manages all things and is a male. The other, a great intelligence, is a female, which produces all things. Following the gender of the Greek words for mind, nous, which is masculine, and intelligence, epinoia, which is feminine, the author of this text explains that these powers joined in union are discovered to be a duality. This is mind and intelligence. These are separable from one another and yet are one, found in a state of duality. Not completely separable, but like yin and yang, they are connected. There is a breath that moves between them and keeps them in harmony. This means, the Gnostic teacher explains, that there is in everyone divine power existing in a latent condition. Think about what I just read about yin and yang on the back of the 10,000 creatures. Yin and yang are in everything. And similarly, there is in everyone a divine power existing in a latent condition. This is one power divided above and below, generating itself, making itself grow, seeking itself, finding itself, being mother of itself, father of itself, sister of itself, spouse of itself, daughter, son of itself, mother, father, unity, being a source of the entire circle of existence. So this is the creative force. Later Neoplatonists might refer to this as the world soul. And I want to keep reading here all the way down the end of this next paragraph. So how did these Gnostics intend their meaning to be understood? Different teachers disagreed. Imagine that. Some insisted that the divine is to be considered masculo-feminine, the great male-female power. Others claimed that the terms were meant only as metaphors, since in reality the divine is neither male nor female. A third group suggested that one can describe the primal source in either masculine or feminine terms, depending on which aspect one intends to stress. Proponents of these diverse views agreed that the divine is to be understood in terms of a harmonious, dynamic relationship of opposites, a concept that may be akin to the Eastern view of yin and yang, but remains alien to Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. Cooperation and creative dialogue between the two genders is foreign, so says Elaine Pagels, to what we find in Judaism and Christianity. They are opposed in that religious tradition. So now we're in radical territory. We have men and women working together. We have male and female working together, and it is at the heart of all of creation. Any comments? A long quote. I hope it didn't get too laborious reading it, but any other comments or thoughts about this? Another characterization of the divine feminine comes from an understanding of the Holy Spirit. We know that when we look at the Trinity of Father, masculine, Son, masculine, and Spirit, pneuma in Greek, which is neuter, there's really not a whole lot of opportunity there to introduce the feminine into our understanding of the Trinitarian God. This, interestingly, became a problem in the High Middle Ages, or I should say, in the midst of scholasticism, when in the church, theology became so heady that the masculine notion of intellect came to be overwhelming, right, in the church, and almost as an afterthought or just a natural outgrowth. Have you ever taken a balloon and you squeeze it and you squeeze it far enough, pretty soon a bubble's going to pop out someplace, that just can't, be held by your squeezing hands. Well, that's what happened in the Middle Ages. The masculine intellect was so overwhelming when the focus on scholasticism that it squeezed theology so much that poof, this bubble popped out at the end, and it was called Mariology. Uh, the devotion to Mary, which became overwhelming, right? And it's no coincidence that it happens precisely at a time that the masculine element in Christianity became, so emphatic. Um, so anyway, why am I saying that? Is we don't have much room when we think about the Trinitarian God to introduce the feminine when we focus on the Greek or even when we focus on the Latin language in which our theology is based. But when we refer to what we know about God and how God creates in the beginning, and we think about what we might refer to as the Spirit of God. In Hebrew, the word is ruach and is very, very clearly feminine. So in the beginning, God creates a human form that we call Adam out of the earth, and he breathes the breath of life, the feminine breath of life, into that form, and Adam becomes a living being. Well, when we start to rely on, some of these more Hebraic images of the feminine aspect of God, it is very easy to see the Trinity in not so much Greek or Latin terms, but in Hebrew terms. The Trinity now can be seen as Father, Son, and Mother. Father, Son, and Mother. This is what Margaret Barker was referring to when she was referring to the priest going and sitting on the feminine throne of the Mother in the Holy of Holies. And this was an aspect of the Gnostic Gospels as well, that this is the Trinity, that God, through the Holy Spirit, creates the Son. And it is a new understanding of the Holy Family. And the feminine imagery is really rich, especially when you think about the metaphor of creation. And again, I think I'd like to read this on page 53 and then compare it to some of the imagery that we don't often think about in Genesis 1, but I just want to, if I've got time, to introduce that to you. But on 53, right at the bottom of the page, uh, think about how unacceptable this imagery would be in Orthodox circles. A work attributed to the Gnostic teacher Simon Magus suggests a mystical meaning for paradise, the place where Adam and Eve were brought into existence, the place where human life began. Grant paradise to be the womb For scripture teaches us that this is a true assumption when it says, I am he that formed thee in thy mother's womb. Not, this is from Isaiah, not referring to an individual, but metaphorically referring to, I am God who formed you, human beings, in the womb of your mother, Eden. Moses, using allegory, had declared paradise to be the womb and Eden the placenta. So you have the womb, and then you have Eden, the Garden of Eden being the placenta in which, humanity is going to develop. The river that flows forth from Eden symbolizes the navel, which nourishes the fetus. Simon claims that the Exodus consequently signifies the passage out of the womb, and that this crossing of the Red Sea refers to the blood. Sethian Gnostics explain that heaven and earth have a shape similar to the womb, and if anyone wants to investigate this, let him carefully examine the pregnant womb of any living creature, and he will discover an image of the heaven and the earth. The just next paragraph. Evidence for such views, declare Marcus, comes directly from the cry of the newborn, a spontaneous cry of praise for the glory of the primal being, in which the powers above are in harmonious embrace. Now, is that metaphor run amok? Or is there something to this that has been suppressed in our Orthodox reading, which is a very technical, almost scientific reading of how the world came into being? But this metaphor of Eden being a placenta within the womb of creation that is impregnated, if you will, by the Holy Spirit of God, and out of that grow human beings. Now, why is this so interesting? Because if you look at Genesis chapter 1 and you understand the cosmology of the time period in which Genesis chapter 1 was written, probably around the middle of the 6th century BCE, it was understood that the earth itself was created within a dome, and there were waters above the dome, and there were waters below the dome. And there was like a little bubble within which God created the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth, and within which human beings were placed. You can't get a much more telling image of a placenta within a dome contained, in a kind of womb. In the beginning, God says, let there be light, and the seed is planted. And then the waters above are separated from the waters below. And the bubble, the placenta, is created. And then God starts to go into the aspects of creating the world, and then places Adam and Eve, places the human couple into the placenta, so to speak, and says, let us create human beings in our image, male and female, he creates them. Almost as if to say, he creates a single entity that contains both male and female aspects. And then at a later point in Genesis 2, those two are divided from each other. Adam was originally androgynous, both male and female, but then was separated so that the two could be in a fuller relationship, according to some of the Jewish legend. Really interesting stuff here. But what it suggests is that there are Gnostics who are reading deeply into the Hebrew scriptures and reading them metaphorically, almost to the exclusion of any kind of literal reading, which the Deuteronomists really tried to impose upon the Jews, 500 years prior to the time of Christ. And it's this metaphorical reading that is going to be suppressed, ultimately suppressed by the Orthodox. Metaphor is fine for people like Irenaeus and Tertullian, But metaphor run amok, a metaphor out of hand, that's what we're getting here. And it's dangerous because, like herding cats, it metaphor is open to all kinds of interpretation. The Orthodox the church fathers want to have a good handle on how that metaphor is going to be interpreted. So we're seeing the battle lines being drawn fairly clearly here. Our time is almost on us, but I want to give you a couple minutes to say anything or to offer any questions or comments.
Dan,
Yeah,
it strikes me that metaphorical view of Genesis, it's reminiscent to me of the arguments that you make with the fundamentalist creationists. And I say that for the reason that the progressive argument is, hey, wait a minute. This isn't science. It wasn't ever intended to be science. It's a fairly simple theological point that's being made with regard to who's responsible for creation.
Mhm.
I think you're going down a little bit that same road
Mhm.
when you use this radical metaphorical analysis.
right. In other words, that they're getting too detailed about, they're almost using metaphor and getting detailed about the interpretation of the metaphor. Is that what you're
Exactly.
saying?
Well,
Yeah,
and an interpretation of Genesis,
right, right, right. Very interesting.
challenging enough, and most people still don't get it, as we're well aware. But
Yeah. So that's a great insight. And it's one that seems paradoxical, but metaphor run amok tends towards a very limited, um, almost literalistic interpretation of something that's not meant to be interpreted.
and all of the way through this discussion, I hearken back to Karl Barth and what he would say about all of this discussion. He'd say, "Why don't you people just shut up? Don't talk about God. You don't know what you're talking about. You can't know what you're talking about. Uh, so just stop."
Right.
And
Which
that's an option.
which is a foundational starting point you know, for the Gnostics here. By that, we really can't talk about the God. The Tao that can be known or named is not the true Tao, or the God who can be named is not the true God. But then, with this very meticulous interpretation of metaphor, you've got this pendulum swinging all the way to the other end, right? You're trying to over explain it. You're trying to, almost scientifically explain what it means point by point by point. That's great. I can't think of a better way to conclude our, our time together. Thank you. Um, any other further thoughts?
Dan, my understanding is, and I think this comes from Scott McCormick, that Adam, from the Greek, stood the word, means humanity or mankind as a form of androgyny. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
doesn't
Adam means of the earth, really.
yeah, it
Adamah.
doesn't that fit with, then it was separated out
Right.
into male and female gender. And Elaine Pagels on page 49 refers to, the sexual, but unless she's talking about the erotic, it'd be a whole lot better to use the term gender.
Well,
Uh,
right.
yeah,
And that conversation has not been had yet when she's writing this, that sex
right.
is, but you're right. I mean, you see how far we've come. I mean, that we can critique now from our vantage point, somebody as extraordinarily intelligent as Elaine Pagels, but that's how far we've come in the 50 years. We're
Yes.
we're
Yes.
making very clear distinctions between gender, and sexuality. And in so doing, we're also able to open up the possibility that, if gender is a social construct, then there perhaps may be more than just one gender, right? Or two genders, excuse me. Um, anyway, go
If
ahead.
you all would, yeah, if you all would let me know if you did not receive, my email about, Pope Leo and the Gnostics, just let me know. Just shoot a reply back and I'll send
Yeah,
it to you again.
I'm looking forward to reading that. So, well, folks, I'll see you. See, wait, do I have something? All of a sudden it occurs to me that I may have a conflict next Wednesday, and I don't know what that is, but I will certainly let you know. Okay. Probably see all of you at some point in the next week or so, or next 3 or 4 days. So we continue to read in chapter 3. When we come back next time, we're going to hear what Irenaeus and Tertullian and the boys have to say about all of this. So, all right, it's always a pleasure. Always the perfect center of the week for me. So I appreciate it so much. See you later. Bye.